I'd now like to welcome the Shadow Minister for Health, Chris Bowen, who's going to be speaking about cancer and new treatments. Please welcome Chris.
Good morning. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks for the very important event that you are running today. I want to begin by acknowledging the fact that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Parliament House, Canberra, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And importantly, note that cancer, of course, can impact and does impact on all Australians, but actually impacts on our First Nations brothers and sisters at a greater rate and at a more fatal rate, such that Indigenous Australians are 40% more likely to die from cancer than the rest of the population. And if we are going to close the health gap, we need to close the cancer gap. And at the moment, we're not doing that. In fact, the gap is widening, not getting more narrow in relation to cancer. So there is much work to be done. And your report, which we're launching today, provides a very useful framework and roadmap to do so, not just in relation, of course, to Indigenous Australians, but for all of us. It's a very good report, and I'm very pleased to be able to join with you and the Minister, I know, a little while ago in launching the Vision 2030 report. Thank you to Richard and Kate and your teams, and to Minderoo and all the patient groups. It's quite clear to me that a report of this quality and substance isn't just the result of the work of a few people, it's the result of the work of many. What the report does is really indicate that we know that 50,000 Australians will die from cancer in 2020, and we know that by 2030, without action, this will increase to 63,000 each year if we do nothing. And the report really, I think, in a nutshell, says that's not an acceptable outcome. We need to do better. We need to do more. We can't accept that as just the normal, as just the reality, the unavoidable, because it's not unavoidable. It is avoidable. We can get those numbers down. Not to zero, of course. Nobody pretends that that's the case, but substantially down. We have seen some cancers come down over the last 20 or 30 years, both in terms of incidence and fatality, particularly fatality. So research and efforts do make a difference, and we need to extend that more broadly, not only to the big cancers, the common cancers, but the rare cancers as well. So I think you'd agree with me to say that as difficult as this report has been to write, as substantial as it is, it's the easy part. It's then getting the attention of governments to implement it and getting the implementation underway, which will be the difficult part. But you'll certainly have my support as you seek to do that. I've recently been talking about some of my priorities as Alternative Health Minister. They really boil down to equity, access and reform, and they cut across your 6 key framework points quite nicely. And I'll just refer to some of your points in my remarks this morning, because many of them speak for themselves, but I do want to reflect on a few points that you make. You talk about meaningful patient engagement and informed decision making, and that requires reform. That requires change. It's not happening at the moment. So health reform has to be at the forefront of our agenda, but it also promotes equity and access. You talked about research and clinical trials. This, of course, is absolutely vital, and it was a very moving presentation we had just a few moments ago, the real-life implications of doing better in relation to both research and clinical trials. We have a great research infrastructure in Australia, but we have to reflect that the vast majority of applications for funding fail. They're not funded. Sometimes we have failure rates of 96% for very good and worthy reform projects. Now, there's a bipartisan level of support for medical research in this building, but we do have to reflect that we can do better. We supported the Medical Research Future Fund. I was disappointed it was funded in part by cuts to the health budget elsewhere, but nevertheless, it's good that it's here. I'd like to see it more transparent. I'd like to see more transparency in the allocation of funds under the Medical Research Future Fund. But putting the Medical Research Future Fund together with the NHMRC, which is a body of many decades standing, it was formed in the 1920s, we have a system that is capable of providing the framework for medical research in Australia. We don't have enough clinical trials in Australia, and clinical trials, as well as being an important part of the research and development system, save lives, can save lives. And one of the big hurdles to having more clinical trials is the state-federal disparity, the discrepancy between state jurisdictions, We are competing with every developed country in the world to attract clinical trials, and our federation doesn't make it easier. If it's not fixed by the time of the next election, it would be amongst my highest priorities as Health Minister to get action in COAG, to get more clinical trials in Australia, to get reform to the clinical trials system so that we are attracting more. And I'd be really prioritising through the COAG Health Ministers Council that reform. It would be my number one COAG priority to get more clinical trials into Australia. You talk about genomics and the next generation of sequencing. And this is huge. And in my time in the portfolio, I've been surprised and amazed to see some of the progress. The first human genome took $2.7 billion and almost 15 years to complete. But now genome sequencing for an individual costs around $1,000 and happens in no time at all. This is a remarkable human achievement. It's truly the basis of personalised health, and it's incredibly exciting. Of course, there's a long way to go, but it's incredibly exciting. We know more about tumour characteristics and DNA and how we can best treat them than ever before. And this has to be at the forefront again of our thinking about our health system in Australia. And then you turn to artificial intelligence, which again is vital and will be important in a recession to help us assess those areas with most potential for investment to save lives. I'm excited about the idea of a data commons, and I'm keen to see more as that idea is developed further. It has my attention. I'm very interested. And priority 6 of Vision 2030 is a very high priority for me, and that is, and I can't put it better than yourselves, and you say, cancer patients to have affordable, equitable and swift access to the best therapies and technologies. Now, I mentioned clinical trials, that's part of that, but it's about so much more than that. We need to ensure our system of getting medicines approved and listed is international best practice, and it currently is not. It simply is not. I said a few weeks ago, if you were starting from scratch, you would not have a Payback, MSAC separate process. You would have a much more coherent process for medicines approvals. They've served us well, Payback and MSAC, but that's not to say that they've kept up with every development. I'm very proud to be a member of the political party which created the PBS back in 1944, but just because it's worked well for decades doesn't mean it isn't capable of improvement. Its last major reform was in 1993, a long time ago. So there is more to be done. The TGA has undergone some reforms over the previous years to get quicker approvals, and that's very welcome. But the TGA is just the start of the conveyor belt of medicines approvals. The Payback itself can take time, and it's understandable and almost inevitable that it does take time to make sure it gets it right. But it should be, of course, we should be ensuring that it is working as quickly as possible. But then there's the post-Payback process. It is not the case necessarily that Payback leads to listing, and that shouldn't be the case. Now, we've had 70 positive Payback recommendations that have not yet been listed, and many of these are for cancer indications. 40% of the recommendations from July last year have not yet been actioned. Now, I don't expect the government to list every Payback recommendation immediately. Of course, I've been around long enough to know that there are some hard-fought negotiations, but it has to be the objective of government to list every single Payback recommendation. There is a bipartisan, in theory, commitment to list every Payback recommendation. That has to be the reality as well. We've seen in recent weeks the very disturbing news that Faslodex, the drug for terminal breast cancer patients, won't be listed because the negotiations haven't proceeded. Again, I don't profess that these things are easy. Negotiations between government and pharmaceutical companies, but it is incumbent on government to get involved and to ensure that those negotiations are proceeding towards listing. Without that, we're going to see continued non-listings. I couldn't put it better than yourselves, who say celebrating the registration and reimbursement of a new therapy should always be tempered by the reality of all those patients who've missed out whilst the negotiations between industry and government have dragged on, and that's 100% true. There have been people who have lost their lives or had ongoing suffering while those negotiations continue, or in too many cases break down. So we do have a parliamentary inquiry into the listing process, which is welcome. I would have liked to have seen more progress on the National Medicines Policy Review by now. I again understand that the Department of Health and the government have a lot on their plate at the moment, but we can't kick these things into the long grass. We do need to do better. And again, your words from your opening video today rang very true to me. If we don't think about the future, if we don't think about what's coming, we won't be able to include these new treatments and therapies into our everyday health system. They'll remain either the preserve of the rich, or they'll sit within research institutes and never make it out in the mainstream cancer care, which is extremely well put. So again, I want to thank you, Richard and Kate and the whole team, for this report. It's very sobering but important and compelling reading for me as the Alternative Health Minister. I'll continue to work with Richard and Kate and the whole team to try and make the ambitions in this report a reality, and it's important that we all do so. Cancer's touched every one of us, including myself, in relation to ourselves or our family members. We have to not accept the reality that 50,000 of our fellow Australians will give their lives each year to cancer. We have to turn. The report provides a very good framework and blueprint to do so. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. We really appreciate your time.